Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 258 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today, we're picking back up in the book of Esther and starting at chapter 5 and reading through to chapter 10. I'm just going to be giving some brief commentary on this latter part of the book of Esther. I will ask you to go through and read this passage if you haven't had a chance, and go ahead and read the entire book. It's really a short book in the Bible, but it is full of showing us how God is at work providentially behind the scenes. Though, as I made mention of yesterday, and I would again ask you to go back and watch yesterday's commentary, as I said then, the interesting part of the book of Esther is God is not directly mentioned. Though we will discuss even more so today how the hand of God is clearly at work around this event. So our four main characters is, of course, King Xerxes. He is the Medo-Persian king of the empire, and if I'm not mistaken, I don't have my notes with me, I believe he was the fourth king of that empire since they conquered Babylon. So, of course, we had King Darius, or we had his other name, King Cyrus, at the time of Daniel. Now, I just need to come back and say this, and I addressed this a little bit more directly yesterday, but it was King Cyrus who allowed the Hebrew people to return to Jerusalem and to the land of Israel. He even helped fund a part of the rebuilding of the temple as well as the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. But there were Jews who stayed behind, and this is where we meet our next two individuals, Mordecai and his niece Esther. Now, Esther, you do need to note, is her Persian name, but we would just use that name at this point. And then there is the fourth individual, Haman. Haman is our protagonist in this story. Now, Haman, he comes from the Amalekites. And if you remember, back at the time of King Saul, that King Saul was told by God to wipe out, to destroy the Amalekites, but he allowed one Amalekite to remain, and possibly we would kind of gather from this event, he allowed even more than the king of the Amalekites, King Agag, to remain. But it was the prophet Samuel who ended up drawing the sword and cutting King Agag to pieces. Now, if you want to go all the way back to my commentary on that event, I told you that we were going to come to a day where we would see an event as to what mishapped or what event unfolded because of the king or King Saul's disobedience. And so here we are at this event. Now, in yesterday's commentary, I talked about how Mordecai would not bow before Haman as he went in and out of the courts, and how Queen Esther ended up going before the king because Haman had created, by deceiving the king really, this edict that all the Jewish people would be killed, and that they had cast lots, or they had rolled the dice to determine what day that the Jews would be killed within the Persian Empire. So the queen has now gone before the king, which was already putting her life on the line, and her uncle had told her that who knows, for such a time as this may be the very reason why you have been placed in this position. Now, again, remember I said God's not mentioned. We would normally say that would have been a great time for Mordecai to have said to Esther, who knows? God may have put you in this position just for this time. But that's not what's said. And I want to elaborate, because yesterday I just spoke right through it as far as saying God's not in the book directly mentioned, but you do see the providential hand of God here. I believe a part of why the Lord is not directly mentioned in the book is because it represents how the Jewish people who remained in the land of Persia felt about God. I believe he was absent from their lives, not the Lord being, but them not involving God directly in their life. Remember, these people had had the opportunity to return to the Holy Land, and they did not. But yet, the wonderful thing that we see is how even a people who are in disobedience are still protected by the Lord. For Mordecai and Esther were disobedient because Esther had married a non-Jew. And Mordecai had supported that. He was the encourager of this relationship with Esther and the king. Yet our God still used that event to protect his people. So the king has asked the queen what she wanted, and she said for him to come to a banquet and for him to bring Haman, because the king is unaware of Esther being a Jew and is unaware of really what Haman is doing in the background. So the king and Haman come to this banquet, and as the banquet ends, the king asks, what else can I do for you? And she says, come back tomorrow and bring Haman with you again. So now Haman, he is leaving the palace all puffed up. All just his ego is so inflated. He's thinking probably to himself, finally, somebody sees me as I see myself. They know how great I am. I'm second to the king, and I'm being invited to the queen's chambers to eat with her and the king. What a wonderful person I am. I think that's what Haman was thinking. Until he gets to the gates. And as he's leaving, and as everyone bows per the law that Xerxes, through I'm certain Haman's insisting, everyone bows before him. That was the law at the time, except for one man, Mordecai the Jew. And now Haman is just exploding. He's already devised to kill all the Jewish people because of Mordecai not bowing before him. But now he's just at wit's end, or Mordecai must die. And when he gets home, his relatives, his wife, everybody encourages him. Yes, this is what you need to do. Go ahead and erect the gallows. We will build the gallows tonight. And you then go before the king and get his permission for you to go ahead and execute Mordecai, because he is disobeying the law of the land, that he is disobeying the law to bow before you, to recognize you as a man of authority. At this very time, as the gallows to hang Mordecai are being built at Haman's house, the king is having a restless night and can't sleep. And instead of counting sheep or counting his gold, he calls in his aides to read through the Chronicles of the king. And who knows how many different books there were. I often think this would be another one of those great things for an archaeologist one day to stumble across. Maybe they already have and just haven't gotten to the point of translating it. But they pull out the annals of the king, the records, and they start reading it. And they come to this point of an assassination plot against the king, and how one man had overheard this assassination plot and had turned in the very men who had planned on killing the king. And the king thought, we never did anything to honor that man, did we? Did we do anything to honor him? No, sir, they didn't honor him. Well, we must do something. So, out of that, they say, what's the name of the man? Mordecai the Jew. Well, we must honor him. And about this time, Haman has arrived at the palace. And the king says to Haman, well, come on in. And the king then asks Haman, he says, what should I do to honor a man? He's like, what would you do? What should I do to honor a man who has done great things in this kingdom? And Haman, again, very puffed up, thinking very highly of himself. His thought is, the king must be getting ready to honor me. I've been already at the queen's chambers, and now I'm going to be there again today. The king really wants to honor me. So he tells the king everything that he would love to have done for himself. He says, put the finest robe on me. Bring out the king's private horse. Have one of the king's officials parade me through town and proclaim, look at what the king does for a man who he wishes to honor. And after Haman has said his wish list of things that he would like to have done for himself, the king says, "Well, go and do all of this for Mordecai the Jew." How crushed Haman had to have felt. He had to have felt as the lowest creature on the face of the earth. And yet, he had to do all of that because he was the one who had to lead Mordecai through the city and proclaim how great Mordecai was. He goes home fuming at this. And his family is not very supportive at this point because now his family turns against him and says, certainly you will come to your downfall at the hands of Mordecai. About this time, the king's officials arrive at Mordecai's house to bring him to Esther's chambers for their second lunch. And in that meal, it all unfolds that Esther reveals that that Haman wants to kill all of the Jewish people. Primarily, that he wants to kill her because she's a Jew. And this is the first time that news has come to the king. At this, the king clearly leaves the chambers. I think it's to likely brings back some guards. And upon returning, he finds Haman grasping at Queen Esther's robes, probably, or falling before her feet, or trying to tell her, please spare my life. And this is what the king walks in on. He's like, would you have your way with my own queen? And he has Haman taken out of the room, arrested. When one of the king's servants says, Haman has gallows built at his house, which he planned to hang Mordecai from. So I say all of this, and you hopefully have read this passage, but I say all of this because you see how the Lord was working in the background. How while Haman was devising this great plan to kill Mordecai, the Lord was keeping the king from sleeping. The Lord led the hand of his servant to the very book and then to the pages that had Mordecai saving the king's life. And then Haman has built gallows, which will be his own destruction. Even later, once his sons are killed, their dead bodies will be hung from these very gallows as a sign to the people that this is what happens to those who stand against the Jews, primarily against the people of God. Now, if you remember, we discussed this before with Daniel. When he's thrown into the lions, it's because the king, when he had made an edict that it said that the Persian kings could, once they had made a rule, once they had sealed it with their signet ring, that it could not be undone. That law was the law. And that was the same case with this law which Haman had made, that the Jewish people were to be killed. So how would that be dealt with? Well, the king has now taken his signet ring away from Haman, who's now dead, and he's given it to Mordecai. And he's placed Mordecai as the second in command of the Persian Empire. And he basically tells Mordecai and Esther, you come up with a plan. And the plan they come up with is that the day leading up to the Jewish extermination at the hands of the Persians, that the Jews can defend themselves, that they can take up weapons, and that they will be allowed to defend themselves. And that's exactly what they do. And in defending themselves, they are able to turn the tide of those who hated them, those who were willing to act on the orders of Haman, even though Haman was long dead. And this is when his sons end up dying. Now, an interesting thing to note here is that the Hebrew people do not take any of the plunder of those who they kill. And it again shows that this wasn't done as an act of greed, but was done as an act of defense. And I think even though God is not mentioned here, they begin to recognize what God has done for them. It says also that a number of the Persians became Jews at this point. We don't really have much elaboration on that, whether they just called themselves Jews or whether they actually converted to Judaism. I'm not certain. The text isn't certain on that part, but it is interesting that it's spoken of in that way. This, to this day, is celebrated as the festival of Purim, which, as I mentioned, Pur, it means dice, and Purim is speaking of when the people of Haman's group rolled the dice to select the day that the Jewish people would be killed on, and yet it ended up becoming a day of their great deliverance. You have to wonder how many of the Hebrews at that time realized how the Lord had protected them, and that very well was probably a part of a number of families returning to the land. You would think so, wouldn't you? Where they're in a foreign land, they almost were eradicated, and the hand of God protected them and preserved them. King Xerxes, of course, will go on to be the king that faces the uh, Grecian army, and he will lose before them. Uh, we don't have those details in the scriptures, we just have them in history. But it is interesting to note that that's the same Xerxes which faced the Greece empire, that it was the very same king that was married to Queen Esther. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.